Good evening all and welcome. I'm going to be taking you to a tour of haunted hotels in tonight's video. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm sharing this story because I need to get it out of my system. It happened a few weeks ago during a 3-night stay at Hacienda Sacnicte, which is a remote hotel just outside the town of Izamal in Yucatan, Mexico. I had no idea it was haunted or any kind of reputation whatsoever when we booked it. It came up in a travel blog as a hidden gem. It was quiet and beautiful and small, and honestly it looked perfect for disconnecting. And we wanted somewhere isolated for a romantic getaway. Merida was only about an hour away, and the place felt worlds apart. It's tucked back from roads amid high trees and lots of empty fields, and if you've never heard of it, which I don't blame you as it's only got like 4 or 7 rooms or something, it's a restored colonial hacienda with white stone walls, a few high arches, and a long courtyard, and a big pool that glows turquoise at night. The rooms are in low buildings around the garden, and it's all stone floor with some heavy wooden doors. We arrived late afternoon. Our rental car kicked up a surprising amount of gravel on the driveway. We were actually concerned we had damaged it, as we didn't want to be charged if there was some kind of damage. And the sun was just starting to set. The main building had the classic hacienda features of wide verandas and a few lanterns hanging on iron brackets. The whole place looked pristine, a lovely boutique that looked frozen in time. We were given a room right outside the restaurant area, and the restaurant itself had a handful of tables and chairs, all made of heavy metal. Remember this, as this will be important for later. We unpacked, explored the small amount of ground, and went to eat in Izamal, the village, and came back. Well, that night at around 2 a.m. I woke up, because I could hear a horrible screeching noise ripping through the silence. It was this metal dragging across stone, long and deliberate, like someone had gripped that heavy chair just outside the room and was pushing it slowly to make the most hideous noise. My heart slammed as I bolted upright. My boyfriend was dead asleep beside me. The sound cut off with a dull clunk, leaving me in total silence. I grabbed my phone, and it was 2:03 a.m., and crept to the door. There was no way I was staying in bed. I needed to see who the hell thought this would be funny to do at 2 a.m. So I opened the door. Outside, there was a single lit lamp by the pool, casting a weak yellow light, but I could see no movement. There was no one outside. The tables were but a stone throw away from me, and there was no one there either. I took a few steps out. I couldn't see any wandering staff, and the position of the courtyard itself meant this whole place was very open, so I should have seen someone, or at least heard them. They wouldn't have had enough time to go anywhere without me hearing them running away on the stones. None of this made sense. I looked around the dim light and decided I'd ignore it, and went back to bed, and just lay there staring at the ceiling. Maybe it was someone in another room rearranging their furniture. I mean, sound carries weird on stones, but it took me a while to fall asleep again. In the morning, the hacienda looked idyllic again. The sun was shining on the pool. The beautiful birds I'd never seen before were making cute little sounds, and breakfast was fresh papaya, sweet bread, and nice coffee in the courtyard. I told my boyfriend about it, and he said it could have just been a dream. We headed into the village of Izamal again, climbed the pyramid for a lovely view over the yellow town, had some traditional marquesitas, which are a bit like crepes, but stuffed with cheese as well as Nutella, and wandered the Covent Square, normal couple stuff. By evening, the grounds glowed under the lantern, The pool lights made the pool turn an ethereal blue-green, and we read by the poolside with a bottle of wine. Exhausted from the sun and the travel, we turned in early, and I think it got dark round about 6. By 8, I was out. But again, I was woken up in the night. Not to sound this time, but to pressure. The feeling of eyes on me. My skin prickled, and I roused, feeling groggy. Something was wrong. I looked down towards the end of the bed, and that's when I saw a clear indentation on the mattress cover, sunk down in the perfect rounded dip right at the corner, with human-sized weight, like there was some invisible person perched on the edge. I stared at it. The sag was too precise for old springs. It definitely had a aliveness to it. My boyfriend, ever the useful companion in spooky situations, was snoring heavily beside me. Throat dry, skin creeping with fear, I shifted my hip fractionally towards it. The mattress rose smoothly, the dip flattening as if whatever was pressing it down had stood up and stepped away. The air cooled around my legs, and I yanked my knees to my chest, clutching the sheets, staring at the empty spot. The bedposts loomed shadowy against the wall, but there was nothing else. No more noise, no more anything. And I was left dumbstruck and horrified. I lay rigid for hours, listening to every noise my boyfriend made, every tiny imperceptible sound from other rooms, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew the bed had moved. I slept very poorly that night, and when the sunlight started to flood in, the room felt safe again. We spent the day out, seeing more ruins, venturing further afield to see other things as well, swim in a cenote, but the tension gnawed at me, and I was relieved that this was our last night in this hotel. I told my boyfriend again, but he told me I had probably just dreamt it again. I wasn't finding these answers very reassuring, and part of me wondered if I was losing my mind. As we had gone swimming, on the final night I crashed hard. I was bone tired. When halfway through sleep, footsteps yanked me awake again. I could hear soft scuffs outside the door, deliberate paces on stone. It didn't sound like shoes, more like bare feet. My boyfriend slept on, and I sat up listening. Another step closer. Maybe it was a fellow guest. But at this point, it didn't sound like they were just moving to their room. It sounded like they were just making the tappity-tap noises on purpose, perhaps to piss off fellow guests. And I had had enough. I opened the door to our room, and of course, the footsteps stopped. The courtyard lay dark, with the pool glowing faintly and the ever-present one light. I could smell the damp earth. I scanned the pillars and the path, and then movement flashed from the peripheral. It was a tall human shape, a shadow darting quickly behind a column. It was a fluid movement, and it was gone in the blink of an eye. When I looked towards that column, expecting someone to come out from behind it, no one ever did. I slowly crept out my door to move my body into a position where I should be able to see behind that column. But when I did, there was nothing. And so I went back to the room, closed the door, and curled under the sheets, replaying the scene in my mind. We checked out in the morning, bright and early. As I slid the key over, the concierge asked if everything had been okay with my stay. And then the words just tumbled out, vaguely. Does anything unusual happen here at night? Like funny noises or anything? The receptionist's face shifted, knowingly. She went on to tell me That I was not the first guest, nor would I be the last in experiencing the creepier side of the haciendas. She went on to tell me something that I hadn't really thought about. Haciendas, these big old colonial homes, are where the Spanish or Spanish descendants held the native Mayan people as basically slaves and forced them to do labor on their land until the end of their days. There was certainly a lot of violence here, a lot of despair, and a lot of negativity. And it's unsurprising that some of it stays behind in the form of hauntings or unfinished business, the precise nature of which they never exactly said what, but that it wasn't a surprise to them that these things persisted, and that I should just try my best not to worry about it. Thankfully, the rest of my time in Mexico was not spooky whatsoever. We loaded the bags quickly and drove away, letting the hacienda shrink into the mirror. In my lifetime, I've worked for several different hotel and motel chains, as well as a few timeshare resorts, so I've seen just about everything you could imagine in that environment, from strangers forming an instant shaky bond after being caught in the crossfires of a deranged gunman, to the horror of witnessing a jumper, to the happier side of things like helping couples celebrate wedding anniversaries and other big occasions. I've also run into plenty of strange and borderline unexplainable incidents along the way. Some with a fairly logical explanation, and some that resisted any sort of practical reasoning. What happened at this particular place definitely falls into the latter category. And for context, I don't scare easily. A few years back, I decided to take a solo trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I like traveling, and this trip was meant to be a simple camping run. I didn't plan it in obsessive detail. I mostly knew which general spots I wanted to stop at and which routes I wanted to take. I've done solo camping trips before and they've never bothered me. I'm always well armed when I travel like that, so if anything were to jump out at me in the dark, be it animal or human, it would probably end up getting shot on sight before it had much chance to cause trouble. I booked sites at various campgrounds along my planned path, making sure each spot was reasonably close to the main road, so that if I needed to leave quickly for any reason, I'd be able to get out without navigating miles of back road in the middle of the night. I left after work on a Friday, drove for about 5 hours steady, and ended up on the outskirts of Bluefield, West Virginia. By that point, I was tired enough that the idea of setting up camp didn't sound appealing, so I decided to grab a hotel room for the night. After about 20 minutes of driving around and checking my options, I came across one of those old independent mom-and-pop motels, which had about 20 rooms all in all with individual outside entrances, and it looked surprisingly clean from the road. The parking lot was well lit, and the building, while dated, didn't have that abandoned or sketchy feel some roadside motels do. Inside the small office, a man in his 40s was working the desk. He seemed genuinely surprised to see a new guest arrive at that time of night. He was average height and built reasonably attractive and very polite. He explained that his grandfather had actually built this hotel back in the 1960s during the free love era, which was why the rooms were still decorated in a retro 60s style. He said he had taken over the operation a few years earlier and mentioned he'd previously been a highway patrol officer who'd been injured on duty, which is how he ended up running a motel instead of being out on the road. He assigned me room 7, located far enough from the ice and vending machines to be quiet, but positioned so that I had a clear view of the front office, and he could keep an eye on my car. I never got any creepy vibes from him, so I took the room without hesitation. The rate for a double was cheap, so I checked in, took the physical key, and headed over. There were 5 other cars in the lot, and I figured one of them had to belong to the owner, which meant there were 4 other guests scattered around the property. I could see that rooms 4 and 10 each had a car parked directly outside, spaced out just enough that no one felt on top of anyone else. I grabbed my overnight bag and went into my room, and it looked exactly like he'd described, pure 1960s. I hadn't expected it to be so clean and well maintained. There was a full little kitchenette along one wall with a compact 2-burner stovetop, a small oven, a microwave, and a mini fridge, all neatly arranged. The bed had an orange bedspread with crisp, white sheets underneath, no stains on the mattress, no suspicious marks, and thankfully no bed bugs. The furniture was dark panelled wood. The tan carpet was surprisingly intact, and the walls were covered in orange, green, and brown paper with funky swirl patterns straight out of an old catalogue. The cabinets even held basic dishes and a set of pots and pans, which made it pretty clear the place could be rented for long-term stays if needed. It was different and quirky in a cool way. I unpacked a little, took a hot shower, and then called the front desk to ask about any restaurants that might still be open. He told me there was a 24-hour cafe a few miles up the road that served good food and good coffee. But there wasn't any delivery service, so I'd have to go and pick it up myself, which wasn't a problem, and after getting a few suggestions from him, I phoned in my order, drove over, picked it up, and about 15 minutes later was driving back with food in my car. I took it to the room, sat down to eat, and ate like I hadn't eaten food in several days, and still had enough leftovers to stash in the fridge for lunch the next day. And that's when things started getting strange. After I had finished eating, I put the leftovers neatly into the fridge and headed into the bathroom to brush my teeth. When I stepped in, my toiletries bag wasn't on the counter where I was sure I'd left it, and none of my personal items were in their usual place. The realization made my skin crawl a little, because I clearly remembered putting everything away when I unpacked, and that included setting my bag right on the bathroom counter. Thinking I might be more tired than I realized, I went around the room and found my bag sitting on the floor next to the bed. I picked it up, pulled out my toothbrush and toothpaste and went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, washed my face, and was trying to convince myself I'd absent-mindedly moved it earlier and simply forgotten. Then I turned in for the night. I must have been asleep for about an hour when someone knocked on my door. It startled me enough that for a second I thought it might be part of a dream, but then the knock came a second time, louder and clearer. I got up, went to the window, and saw a young woman sitting outside. She was thin with long blonde hair and appeared to be in her early 20s. I spoke through the closed door and asked her what she wanted. She said she needed to use my phone. I told her no, and she should go to the front desk instead. She glanced around but never looked directly at me, even though I was clearly watching her through the window. She turned to her right and walked out of view towards the office. I may not be a kid anymore, but I'm not stupid. That old "can I use your phone" trick is one of the classic ways people try to get you to open your door, and I wasn't about to fall for it. I called the front desk and talked to the owner, who introduced himself as Paul, and told him a young blonde woman had just knocked on my door and asked to use my phone, and that I had refused and sent her towards the office. He paused before answering and then said he was outside, standing by his car, smoking, and hadn't seen anyone walking around. He told me to look out my window at the office, and when I peeked through the curtain, he was there next to a Jeep, cigarette in one hand, phone in the other. He asked me to describe her and said he kept an eye out in case she showed up again, adding that there were a few homeless drug addicts in the area who moved fast if they were turned away and could disappear pretty quickly. I also mentioned the toiletries bag incident and asked if anyone might have come into my room while I was gone earlier. He said that would be difficult, as the room still used traditional keys, and the only other key was supposedly on his keyring, which he showed me was clipped on his belt loop. He swore he hadn't been in my room, but said he'd check the security cameras and let me know in the morning if he saw anything. Since nothing was actually missing, just moved, I thanked him and went back to bed, telling myself fatigue was making me feel stranger than things really were. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but this time it was because I felt someone or something sit down on the bed. At first I thought I was slowly sliding off the mattress, but then I realized there was a distinct dip forming behind me, like weight was being applied in one spot near my lower back. The temperature along my spine dropped sharply, and I could feel the covers shifting as if someone was pulling the sheets up. Then a cold hand settled on my right hip. My entire body locked up, I mean literally froze. 1,000 questions shot through my mind at once. How did anyone get into my room with the door locked and the deadbolt on? Was it Paul? Had he somehow used his key and slipped in without me waking? Was it the girl from earlier? I couldn't tell if the presence was male or female, only that it was real and close. Terror grabbed a hold. Cold sweat formed on my upper lip and crossed my forehead. My heart felt like it had climbed into my throat, beating so hard I could barely breathe. I started to shiver, not just from the cold on my back, but from pure panic. And then I heard a faint, unmistakable voice right behind me. "You're warm. I like this." I eased my hand under my pillow and wrapped my fingers around my 9mm Glock. In one motion, I screamed at the top of my lungs, threw the covers off, jumped up, and fired 2 shots straight down into the mattress where the pressure had been. Then I scrambled for the light switch, flicked it on and froze. There was no one there. Just 2 smoking, blackened holes in the bed where the bullets had gone in. I checked under the bed, in the bathroom, every corner of that small room, and there was nothing and no one. When I finally went to the door and checked it, the deadbolt was still engaged, and the door was still locked from the inside. According to that, no one had entered. But something had been in that bed with me. A pounding on the door stepped me out of my gaze. I opened it to find Paul standing there with a gun in hand, looking wide awake and serious. I quickly told him what happened, and he walked me over to the office. On my way, a man from room 4 stepped outside looking disheveled and annoyed about being woken by gunshots. Paul spoke to him quietly, and the man went back to his room. Inside the office, Paul poured me a shot of whiskey, which I gracefully accepted. He then told me he had something important to show me on CCTV. He had already rolled the recording back to the time I arrived and had been scanning through it. On the screen, we watched me pull into the lot, go into the office, chat with him, check in, and then head into my room. About half an hour later, he pointed out my car leaving and coming back from the cafe 17 minutes later. You could see me get up with the food and coffee, go to my room and close the door. About an hour later, the recording showed him stepping outside, lighting a cigarette, and leaning against his Jeep. Then you could see my room's curtains move as I looked out the window. From the camera's perspective, there was no one standing at my door when I drew the curtains open. No woman, no person at all. What there was, though, was a faint little orb of light drifting into view, moving along the walkway from further down and hovering just outside my door. It might have been a bug catching the light, but the timing was uncanny. After a few seconds, it blinked out of sight, and on the video, I soon moved away from the window. You could see Paul answer his phone, presumably my call. And a moment later, I reappeared at the window and he waved up to my room. He went outside, I closed the curtains, and that's when I tried to go to sleep. He then jumped ahead to around 3:17 a.m. and pointed at the screen. The orb reappeared in the camera's field of view. Brighter this time, it drifted up to my door, but instead of winking out, it seemed to turn slightly and then vanish into the door itself, as though passing directly through it. What had felt to me like an eternity, the presence, the voice, my reaction, only took about 3 minutes of footage. After that, you could see 2 faint but clearly visible flashes of light behind my drawn curtains, which matched the 2 gunshots I'd fired into the mattress. Then the video showed Paul sprinting out of the office with his gun drawn, running straight towards my room. The rest of the story, of course, played out in real time from there. My head was spinning as we sat there in that small office watching the replay. We both sat silently for a while, listening to the clock tick, neither of us sure what to say. Paul eventually got up, poured us another shot of whiskey, and I drank it as quickly as the first, feeling the burn move slowly down my throat into my stomach. He asked what I thought the orb was. I told him that's what people usually call them, orbs, and that while it could technically be a bug or some dust reflecting on the camera's light, it struck me as far too coincidental that it showed up exactly when my experiences happened. He said he didn't really believe in coincidence. I admitted that I thought it might be something ghostly. He countered that no one had died in that particular room as far as he knew, and that he'd never heard any other guest report anything like this. I apologized for shooting the mattress and promised to pay for it. He said he'd gladly take the compensation and offered to move me to another room, asking that I promise not to shoot that one up. I laughed weakly but declined the offer. I just wanted to leave. We exchanged information, and I told him to charge the mattress to my credit card, and after he ran it, he gave me directions to the nearest national park campsite, and I went back to the room to pack. It was quiet when I walked back in, but I still moved quickly, eager to be out of there. I grabbed my bag, my leftovers from the fridge, and my other belongings, then returned the key to Paul, shook his hand, and got back to my car. The moment I pulled out of that parking lot, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was more than ready to get to my campsite and leave that little roadside Bates Motel experience behind. I still think of that place from time to time. I wonder if Paul has had any more complaints about strange visitors, moving items, or unseen bedmates. I'll probably never know exactly what caused those things to happen that night, but I do know that from now on I'll take my chances with whatever goes bump in the night at the campsite. Bears and drunks I can handle, whereas ghosts, not so much. Let me preface this by saying I do believe in the supernatural myself, but consider myself generally skeptical on a case-by-case basis. I myself have not had any supernatural experiences in this room, so everything I say will be second-hand at best. For reference, I work at a small 40-ish room motel in the Midwest, in a relatively small college town. We're on the lower end of the budget in town, but much nicer than the other low-budget properties nearby, so we tend to serve people like the college students and their families, as well as pilot cars, truckers, and a handful of long-term contractors. We also acted to help quarantine college students during the pandemic, which is when I was hired, in 2021. I have only one other worker at the front desk, an elderly woman called Trish. She's been working here since before I was born, and coincidentally has been working here through the location's past 3 owners and name changes. Currently, our hotel is owned by a man called Mr. Smith. Trish is Catholic, Smith is Hindu, and I am a Protestant. This religious information is relevant to later. In 2021, we had blocked out the entire second floor to be used by the college for housing for their COVID quarantine. They also stationed an RA there called Andy. Shortly after I started the job, we had a girl come in from the university for her quarantine. I went through the quarantine procedures with her, gave her a goodie bag Mr. Smith had made for the students, and the key to room 206. A short while later, she returned and said the room smelled awful and like something had died in there. Insisted it was like rotting meat. I thought this was strange because we disinfected all the quarantine rooms thoroughly after each stay, to the point where they only smelled like disinfectant, and did so strongly. But we had lots of rooms for the students available, so I moved her to a different one and called Mr. Smith to let him know, and he asked me if I would check the room and sanitize it just in case. so I put on the gear and went up to the room. I didn't smell anything bad at all, but I also didn't smell the disinfectant either, so I sprayed the room again and left and didn't think much of it. A few months later, after the college quarantine period was over and we had our whole property back. At this time I was training a new hire on the overnight shift. Trish or I would do the audit first thing in the morning, and I was staying in 101 right off the lobby so that the new hire could come and ask for help if needed, and I could sleep. I had another job at the time as well, so I was effectively working 2 8-hour jobs 5 times a week. It was rough. One evening, a weekend if I recall, I checked a guest into 205, a sweet middle-aged woman. Everything seemed fine. She'd been in a few times before, and when the overnighter came in, there were no issues and I went to bed, hoping I'd get a full night's sleep. I never once did get a full night's sleep during this period, but it's always nice to hope. Around 3:30 in the morning, the phone in my room rings. It's the overnighter telling me he has a guest with a complaint, and he doesn't know what to do. He tells me that the woman at the desk is asking to be moved because someone in the next room is banging. Our overnighter's first language was not English, so I wasn't sure what this meant, but decided I'd shamble up to the counter in my pajamas at 3 in the morning. The guest, to her credit, apologized profusely and said she didn't need any credit or help, she just wanted to be moved out of 206. It was at this moment I remembered the earlier incident and became interested. I asked her what was going on and she said, "It's as if there's a person in the next room going through a very troubling time. I tried to knock on their door to comfort them, but they wouldn't answer. They're just sobbing and hitting the wall." I was perplexed, because I was looking at our card slot. We still used cards to check in guests, and I could plainly see that no one was staying in 206, assuming the overnighter had done his job properly. I didn't say this to the guest though, just apologized and moved her to a corner suite. We didn't have any other rooms of her type available beside 206, and I wasn't about to move her into the room she swore was having a meltdown. She thanked us repeatedly and left for the night, and we didn't hear from her again. The next morning Trish showed up, and recalling the first mini-story, I asked her what the deal was with 206. She gave me a forlorn look and said, "Oh, is it still happening?" I raised my eyebrow and asked what that meant. She gave me a long sigh and went about preparing breakfast. I had to be at my next job at 8, but I was eager to hear the explanation, so I helped her set up while she explained. "A few years ago, a man took his life in 206. Geez, did you find the body?" Trish nodded and continued. "Yeah, well, sort of. The cleaning ladies found him first as usual, but I had to show the police and supervise them, cleaning up. I've seen people die here before, but never in such a messy way. Looked like he'd used a shotgun to take his head off." "That's awful," I said. "Did we make the head housekeeper clean that up?" "No, thankfully the police gave us a phone number to call when we hired some professionals. There was a lot of blood and other stuff on the wall and bed. We had to replace the bed, I think. Anyway, after that happened, there was about a week where the guests in the neighbouring rooms would report that someone was in the room and in distress and wouldn't open up. Of course, there's nobody in the room because we were renovating it at the time. It got to the point where I decided to call in a priest, and he came to visit the room and said nothing was wrong. I'm not sure what he might have done to it, but I haven't had many problems since then. Occasionally someone reports a disturbance and I tell them I'll give them a warning, and it seems to go away. A couple of months ago, one of the college students told me it smelled like rotting meat when I checked her in, so I moved her to a new room. Did anyone else describe that to you?" Trish frowned and shook her head. "No, I don't think so. But I don't know for sure. My memory's not what it used to, but I wouldn't be surprised. That room is haunted for sure." I hadn't known Trish long at that time, but looking back, I can confidently say she believed that, and was not, as my mum put it, trying to BS me. The last encounter was probably a year or so ago. My father was visiting for a few days, and while he isn't a priest, he is very involved in his church and has a lot of education in that area. He, for the record, does not believe in hauntings. On top of this, he asked for the room type of 206, and we have only 4 of those, so I gave him that room. I figured he doesn't believe in it, so either he will now or it wouldn't be a problem. Perhaps a dick move of me, but I'd never heard of anyone actually having harm done to them, so I didn't think it would be a problem. He checked in and was due to stay for 3 or 4 days, and after the first night I asked him, "Hey Dad, how was your night?" I always ask this as a courtesy whenever any of my family stays, but obviously I had an ulterior motive here. My dad replies that it was fine, the bed was comfy, and he had to turn the AC off though because it was pretty cold. I asked if it warmed up after that and he just said it did. Dad was there for another few nights and didn't mention any problems with the room, until the last day after he'd already checked out. We were in a chain diner for breakfast and he asked for coffee. I remarked on this. He doesn't usually drink coffee and he responds, "I haven't been sleeping so well." I was a bit taken aback and did not think of the potential haunting anymore, and at that point I was like, "I asked you every morning how your night was and you always said it was fine." Dad nodded enthusiastically and said, "Oh, the room was fine. I just felt, not great. At night I had the same nightmare a few nights in a row." Dad does not usually talk about his emotions at all. I sometimes doubt he has them at all. So I was immediately thinking about Trish's explanation. I couldn't help myself and blurted out, "Trish said that room's haunted." Dad rolled his eyes and chuckled. "So you gave it to me, huh?" He didn't talk about the recurring nightmare anymore, and he hasn't brought it up since, but ever since then, I have been convinced 206 is haunted. I did try staying in that room one night myself. The building was being fumigated, but I didn't have any out of the ordinary experiences at all. Trish says this is because the ghosts fade away over time. Mr. Smith said not to tell guests any of the rooms were haunted. I didn't think he believes they are either, but he's got a little Hindu god at the front of the desk that I was told was a prosperity god of some kind, and he religiously rubs it any time he goes in or out. And that does it for me, folks. If there are any developments, I'll be sure to let you know. If anyone else has ever worked in a haunted hotel, I'd be very curious to hear it. My first job was at an old hotel that had been renovated and turned into a franchise spot. But you could still tell that it used to be something else. It even had a fancy historic name attached to it, something like the Old Regency Lodge, even though it was now just another chain off the highway. I worked there as a cook in the kitchen bar. My aunt also worked there, but she handled breakfast in the very early mornings. That meant she was alone at dawn setting up the buffet, and I was alone in the late evenings cooking bar food and cleaning up for the night. About 4 months into me working there, the hotel temporarily lost its liquor license. The bar shut down completely, but I still had to come in every morning, so for 6 hours straight, I'd be in a massive, quiet kitchen with maybe 5 orders total, and half of those were for hotel staff. And that's when things began to get uncomfortable. First off, the basement. Our clock-in room was down there, along with storage rooms and some kind of religious shrine the owners had set up. The ceilings were low, the lighting was dim, and a lot of it still looked original, with old stone walls and pipes running overhead. That area still had not been renovated. There were also old elevator shafts down there that had been boarded up and chained off in the laziest way possible. Beyond those were several empty rooms and long hallways I had never explored. Every single night when I'd clock out, I would get this overwhelming sense of dread. The best way I can describe it is that feeling you had as a kid when you'd sneak downstairs in the dark to grab a snack. I'd swipe my card, hear the beep, and practically sprint back to the elevator. But the worst area wasn't the basement. The kitchen connected directly to the hotel's ballroom, which were massive and usually empty during the week. There was a narrow, dark hallway that staff had to use to take out trash or dump fryer oil. At the very end was a door leading outside to the dumpster. I hated that hallway. Sometimes the staff entrance doors to the ballroom would be left open, and I swear every time they were, I felt uncomfortable. The ballrooms weren't pitch black. You could usually see the far walls and stacks of chairs pushed to the side, but on certain nights there would be this strange wall of darkness close to the doorway. I could still see the chairs and wall beyond it, but the space in front of them looked unnaturally dark, like a shadow with depth. It made my stomach drop every time. Eventually I stopped looking in that direction altogether, and just stared straight ahead whenever I passed through the hallway. But now for the real stuff I can't explain. There was a swinging door that would connect the bar area to the kitchen. One of the bartenders, called Megan, would come through it all the time to grab beers from the freezers in the back. At least 5 or 6 times, I clearly saw someone, a full human-shaped figure, push open the door and walk into the kitchen. I'd be cooking while listening to a podcast or audiobook with one earbud in. When I'd see Megan come in, I'd pause what I was listening to so that we could chat for a while. I'd wait, and wait, and wait, and after a bit I'd call out, "Megan?" to no answer. So I'd walk back to where the freezers were and there'd be no one. The kitchen would be completely empty. There was no way she could have left without me seeing her because the swinging door is directly in my line of sight. The figure always moved naturally too, not like a shadow flicker or trick of the light. It looked like a person casually walking in. Each time it happened, I brushed it off and told myself I must have imagined it. I never brought it up to Megan because I'd already felt weirded out enough working alone in that creepy place. But that wasn't all. While working there, I'd randomly start thinking about my grandfather. He wasn't really present in my life growing up, and honestly I rarely thought about him at all. But in the kitchen, memories of him would come and hit me out of nowhere, vivid and detailed, like I was reliving moments instead of remembering them. Sometimes I'd go sit in the kitchen manager's office on my break, and suddenly get hit by a very strong smell, my grandfather's scent. Not just cologne, but that specific mix of cologne and work materials. He used to do handyman work and construction work and always smelled faintly like wood and dust and whatever he'd been repairing that day. It made no sense. My manager was a woman and always left hours before my shift started. No men worked there in the evening, and the smell would come in thick waves, like someone had just walked past me. What made it stranger still was the feeling that came with it wasn't scary but warm and comforting, almost nostalgic. Eventually one day, my aunt and I were talking about work, and somehow the topic of weird stuff came up. That conversation gave me chills. I mentioned the overwhelming feeling in the basement, the dark presence near the ballroom, the figure I kept seeing in the kitchen, and the random memories and smells of my grandfather, and her face went pale. She slowly told me she had experienced almost exactly the same thing. She said she'd randomly smell her own father's house while working breakfast shift. He used to burn wood in a stove, and the smell would cling to everything, and sometimes it would come out of nowhere in the empty kitchen. She also talked about feeling watched in certain parts of the hotel, especially near the ballroom and downstairs. We were literally finishing each other's sentences. What stood out was that both of us felt the same emotional difference between the presences. Whatever was around the kitchen and bar area felt gentle, almost protective, like a fatherly energy. But the thing near the ballrooms and the basement felt sinister, like something you didn't want there. Neither of us had gone looking for those experiences. They just happened casually, and we would shrug them off like, well, that was weird, and move on. Talking about them out loud was when we finally connected the dots. I genuinely believe there are at least 2 entities in this hotel, one that's warm and familiar, and a dark one that lingers in the older parts of the building. There are probably more things that happened that I can't remember anymore, but those are the ones that impacted me the most. I've never really been a hardcore believer in the paranormal even after all of this, but there was definitely something haunting that hotel. My husband and I were renting an Airbnb for a few nights. It was basically a mother-in-law suite. It was literally one room on a solid concrete foundation. The first night we were getting ready for bed, and heard a loud growl from outside the window. We immediately looked out the window, and when we saw nothing, my husband went outside to look and still saw nothing. The next night we were just chilling, not thinking about this at all. We were both reading with no TV on or anything, and then the loudest, deepest growl I ever heard came from directly under the bed. The sound came from inside the room. We immediately freaked out and flipped the mattress, but there's nothing there. There's nowhere else in this room for anything to be. The next morning I went outside and inspected this little house thoroughly. There was no way for anything to be under the house, no crawl space or above. I told the lady who owned the property what we heard and asked if there had been any wild animals in the area that could make this sound. She said no. I googled this. Google said no. I've worked with dogs professionally for years. Not even the biggest dog could growl that deeply, let alone hide unseen in our room. Sometimes I'll be chilling in bed and remember this and still feel the pure terror that I did that night. It was late August in Nelson, British Columbia, when my family travelled for a regatta on the beautiful Kootenay Lake. My sister Elizabeth, my father and I drove our beat-up Dodge Dakota through winding mountain roads into town. The air was warm, and the haze from distant wildfires drifted over the hills, carrying the sweet, acrid scent of burning pine. Mountains rose around us like dark sentinels, and sunlight pierced through the canopy of slanting beams, spilling over the highway, guiding us towards the lake. Nelson appeared suddenly, a small city cradled between water and mountains, a once quaint and commanding place. Heritage buildings of brick and stone lined the narrow streets. We were tired from the drive and eager for dinner, but I remember even then feeling the building's imperceptible presence. Our room was a standard two-queen layout. When you entered, the bathroom door sat directly ahead. To the left was the bed my sister and I shared. To the right was my father's. The bathroom created a sort of dividing corridor, with just enough space to feel separate from one another. We unpacked, each of us taking turns in the bathroom. My father was ready first and left to meet our rowing coach Martin in the lobby. My sister straightened her hair in the bathroom, and I sat at the desk, writing a letter to my boyfriend at boot camp. That's when I heard the first knock. It was polite, just 3 taps, enough to make me think my father had forgotten his key already, and I rose and opened the door and stared into an empty hallway. The corridor stretched both ways, which was still, with not a single other door open. I couldn't hear retreating footsteps nor see anyone out there, and I frowned, closing the door, and told myself it must have just been my sister bumping something in the bathroom. When she emerged, dressed and ready, I told her I'd be down shortly, and she left with her key alone. I finished sealing the envelope when a second knock came. This time it was louder and insistent. A cold ripple of unease crept down my back. My sister had her key. My father was with Martin. Why knock, and why twice? I pressed my eye to the peephole, and I couldn't see anything. The hallway was utterly empty. There was no motion or sound. But all the same, I opened the door a crack, peeking out. Still nothing. My heart thudded as I stepped back into the room. I told myself I was imagining it, grabbed my bag, and hurried down to meet the others. My father and Martin went to the lounge after, leaving my sister and me to return to our rooms. We slipped into bed, stomachs full, and that's when the faintest scratching started from inside the bathroom wall. It was soft at first, like the sound of mice, and we whispered back and forth, convincing ourselves that's all it was, until we fell into a restless sleep. I dreamed all night, but could not wake from it. Murky, oppressive nightmares evaporated by morning, leaving only an uncomfortable feeling in my chest. My sister was tired and she told me that she had heard footsteps pacing outside our door throughout the night. Our father chuckled when we asked if he'd noticed anything, brushing it off as his CPAP machine drowned out any sound. The next day passed like a reprieve. We spent it at the lake, prepping boats and preparing for races the next day, and after prep was finished, a couple of teammates, my family and I, went on an outing to explore the town. Nelson's shops and cafes were bright and inviting, a world away from the hotel. But that evening, after a team dinner at an Italian restaurant, our unease returned. We opened our hotel room door to a sight that made us cold. Every pillow in the room, from our beds to the chairs, had been arranged in a perfect circle on my father's bed. In the center of the circle stood one long, cylindrical pillow, balanced upright as if by unseen forces. The soft mattress should have made it impossible, but there it was, defying both gravity and logic. For a moment we said nothing, staring. Then my father exhaled sharply and began putting the pillows back. We were too tired to argue with him. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I was listening to the faint sounds of the footsteps pacing up and down the hallway. The next morning was race day. We fled the hotel early, spent the day at the lake, and were exhausted but triumphant, staying out until nightfall and celebrating with teammates. But each time we returned to the hotel, my sister and I felt it pressing on us. The sense that something unseen did not approve of our presence. Our final morning after breakfast at the hotel's general store restaurant, curiosity got the best of us, and we asked our server if the hotel was haunted. Her face lit up. She told us of renovations stirring up activity, of a maid whose cleaning cart had been thrown across the hallway, of guests talking about unseen hands, leaving scratches that were impossible to inflict. We were relieved, strangely, to know that we were not alone in our experiences. And when we left the hotel later that day and drove out of town, Nelson looked as serene as it had when we'd first arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel still had other guests to torment. I'm just glad I wouldn't be in their number. I am currently trying to sleep outside the Farnsworth Inn in my car. I'm parked in the lot with the seat pushed back, with my boyfriend snoring on the passenger side. I'm still too wired to even close my eyes. Before I can get into what happened tonight, I will need to give you a bit of background, so what I'm about to say doesn't sound completely ridiculous. My boyfriend and I both grew up in genuinely haunted houses. His childhood home was serious enough that it was investigated and eventually exorcised, while mine was a creaky over 200-year-old house where strange things were just a part of the everyday life. Because of that, both of us consider ourselves pretty sensitive to paranormal activity and are not easily spooked by every random noise or cold draft. Tonight, though, whatever is in this place really pushed that sensitivity to the limit. We checked into the Sarah Black room earlier in the afternoon. As soon as we walked in with our overnight bags and shut the door behind us, I felt something brush along the back of my neck and down the upper part of my back, like a light, deliberate pass of air or fingers. I tried to brush it off as the air conditioner kicking on, all my nerves reacting to finally being in a famous haunted inn, and told myself not to overreact before anything actually happened. After settling in a bit, we took out some of our ghost hunting equipment, the spirit box, our little dead bell, and a couple of cat toys with motion-activated lights that we set carefully in a drawer and on the floor to use as simple detectors. Around 4 p.m, nothing particularly dramatic happened with any of them. The occasional door handle jiggled, or distant creaks that echoed through the walls, but we chalked that up to other guest doors closing, the old wooden structure shifting, as well as the normal hotel noise that just travels through an old shared building. Well, right before dinner at around 5 p.m., I went into the small bathroom to use the toilet and wash my hands. While I was standing at the sink, the cat ball we'd put on the vanity across from me suddenly lit up and started flashing repeatedly. It sat there rolling and blinking like something had tapped it, even though it was on the other side of the room and nothing else was moving. When it finally stopped, I walked over to it, trying to find a rational explanation. I touched the vanity, shook the desk a bit, and walked around the ball. I even bounced on my toes a few times to see if vibrations from my movement would set it off again. It stayed completely still and dark, no matter what I tried. Later, during the cellar tour, we found that this was reportedly the exact spot where a man named Jeremy died, and that bit of information lodged itself firmly in the back of my mind for the rest of the night. After dinner and the tour, we got back to the room, opened a bottle of wine, and pulled out our equipment again. We ran the spirit box for a while, listening for clear responses or unusual interference, but nothing particularly strong or convincing came through. I guess you could say we were slightly disappointed but also relieved, and we decided to start getting ready for bed. And that's when everything changed. I suddenly caught a strong, distinct waft of perfume. It smelled like an older, floral fragrance, nothing like what I wear, and it came out of nowhere in the middle of the room. At that exact moment, the cat ball on the floor lit up and began flashing furiously, and the dead bell, which hadn't made a sound all evening, started to ring in clear, chiming bursts. We panicked a bit and started bugging out, talking too fast, my nerves spiking while my boyfriend was already exhausted and clearly done with my constant commentary, told me a bit impatiently to close my eyes and go to sleep, insisting that I would be working myself up over nothing. By about 11:30, he was in a deep, heavy sleep, snoring steadily beside me while I lay awake, head under the covers trying to shut out the room and calm down. That was when I started hearing dragging sounds from somewhere above us, in what I assumed to be the attic space. It sounded like someone slowly dragging something across a rough floor, then setting it down, and then dragging it again. My heart started pounding as I listened to it repeat a few times. Then I distinguished footsteps out in the hallway. They were slow, measured steps that came and went near our door. I shook my boyfriend awake and told him what I was hearing. He groggily repeated the same line, so just to go to sleep and stop listening too hard and try not to think about it. And eventually the sounds died down enough that I managed to drift off for a short while. Around 12:30 a.m. I woke up again, this time to the same sudden perfume, smell, and a sense that something was different in the room. I lifted my head and checked the clock. The cat ball on the floor was going off non-stop, flashing steadily as if someone were tapping it again and again. I also really had to pee, but I was terrified of leaving the relative safety of the bed. I lay there arguing with myself for a while until 1 a.m., when I finally mustered the courage to get up. My boyfriend had it much worse in his childhood home, and tends to shrug a lot of this off, but it was genuinely bugging me because I didn't know these particular spirits and had no idea how they behave. As I walked past the cat ball on my way to the bathroom, nothing I did set it off. It was completely dark and still, which somehow made it creepier, given how active it had just been. I used the bathroom quickly as I hurried back into bed. At around 1:45, I heard footsteps again outside the door. That same steady pace up and down the hallway. My nerves were shot by then, but I was curious and stupid enough to try an invitation, and I called out, "If there is anyone with us now, set the cat ball off." And almost immediately, it started flashing like crazy, lighting up in frantic bursts on the floor. That was my breaking point for that stretch. I shook my boyfriend awake and told him what had happened. He could see I was really scared, so he stayed up with me until I finally drifted off again, even if he still didn't seem completely convinced anything serious was going on. Sometime around 3 a.m. our roles reversed. I was finally asleep, exhausted and oblivious while my boyfriend lay awake in the dark. He later told me that he heard 6 very loud, hard knocks on our door in a row, followed by the sound of someone pushing or rushing against it, as if trying to repeatedly force their way into the room. He said it sounded like whoever or whatever it was throwing its weight against the 3 separate locks on the door, testing them one by one. Then the doorknob started turning and rattling like someone was absolutely determined to get inside. He was lying there wide-eyed, trying to calm himself down and rationalize what was happening. But he didn't wake me up because he knew I would completely freak out, and he didn't want to escalate the panic. Eventually the knob stopped moving and the knocking ceased. Just when he thought it might be over, he said the entire bed suddenly yanked and shook in one clean, powerful motion, like something had grabbed the frame and given it a hard single jerk. When he checked the time, it was about 3:35 a.m. And from then on he heard the door, noises and footsteps continue off and on again as the hallway activity carried on outside. I woke up around then, as he was finally starting to doze off, and the first thing I noticed were the footsteps in the hall pacing back and forth outside our room. I immediately started freaking out, and that's when he told me very calmly what he had just experienced with the knocks, the door handle, and the bed shaking. Hearing that he'd gone through all of that and stayed relatively unfazed while I slept on only added to the sickening feeling in my stomach. No matter how composed he tried to be, those are not the kind of things you brush off easily. By about 4 a.m., I'd hit my limit, finding out there had been 6 heavy knocks, attempts at the door, and a violent bed shake on top of everything else pushed me over the edge. I decided I wasn't going to lie there and wait to see if something was sitting at the end of our bed or looming over me. The number of knocks and the intensity of the shaking felt unmistakably malevolent to me, not just playful or curious. I'm sure I'd irritated him with my fear and constant what-ifs, and he was definitely exhausted by then, but I told him plainly that I was done. I wasn't comfortable in that room anymore, and I was heading out to the car to try to sleep somewhere that at least had a locked metal shell around us instead of an antique wooden door that something had already tried to test. Now it's almost 8 a.m., and instead of waking up in a historic cozy room at the Farnsworth Inn, I'm parked outside in the chilly morning air, typing this all out on my phone while my boyfriend sleeps in the passenger seat, finally catching some rest. I'm severely sleep deprived, my nerves are shot, and I'm sure some of this might come across as jumbled, but that's my chaotic night. If anyone needs clarification or anything, just let me know. I just needed to get this all off my chest. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's stay at the haunted hotels. If you did, you can let me know down below. I'd like to extend a huge thank you, as always, to our members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen. And if you'd like some additional perks, feel free to follow the link down below to find out more. But that's it from me, and I'll see you on Thursday for even more scary stories. Until next time, stay awesome, and good night.